From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. Amid the global meltdown over tariffs and the chaos of a trade war, it would be easy to miss the rumblings of an actual war gathering pace.
US President Donald Trump says that he'll bomb Iran if it won't agree a deal on its nuclear program. Iran's vowed to strike back, describing Trump's warnings as an affront to international peace and security.
A letter from US President Donald Trump to Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah al-Khamenei had, in effect, two sides. One offering a possible window of engagement, the other a menu of threats.
Tensions between the U.S. and Iran are growing as the Islamic Revolutionary Guard is now on high alert amid an increasing American military presence in the Middle East. Iran says it's preparing its army as President Trump warns of potential U.S. military action unless Tehran comes to an agreement over its nuclear program.
Over the past week, satellite images have shown the buildup of American forces, aircraft carriers and stealth bombers in the Indian Ocean, poised for a military strike on Iran. Could there be a war? The answer might be determined by crunch talks this weekend.
We're dealing with the Iranians. We have a very big meeting on Saturday, and maybe a deal is going to be made. That would be great. I think if the talks aren't successful with Iran, I think Iran is going to be in great danger, and I hate to say it, great danger, because they can't have a nuclear weapon.
Ahead of the talks, there are already rumours of splits between Iran hawks who want a war and those that want a deal, tearing the Trump administration apart. The story today: is America heading for war with Iran?
I'm Holly Dagres, a senior fellow at the Washington Institute, a think tank based in Washington, D.C., and I'm the curator of the Iranist newsletter on Substack.
Holly, you hear from people in Iran very regularly. At the moment, with the new Trump administration coming in and applying what they're calling maximum pressure, firstly, give us a sense of what that means, and what are you hearing from Iran on how that's playing out? How is it affecting ordinary people's lives?
Maximum pressure is a continuation of Trump 1.0, which is, if your listeners remember, in 2018, the Trump administration withdrew from what was known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, or what we popularly know as the Iran nuclear agreement, despite Tehran not violating the deal at the time. And Trump had always said that he wanted to make a better deal than his predecessor, Barack Obama. Of course, he never got that deal. So when Trump took office, he instituted a maximum pressure policy again, which was that they were going to drive in the hopes of hurting Iran's economy to a point to bring on negotiations and for Iran to change its behavior. And so as a part of that, he also sent a letter to Iran via the United Arab Emirates, and it basically said, you need to talk with us about an array of issues, including your nuclear program, or else if you don't do that within 2 months, there's going to be a military strike on your country. And presumably he meant the nuclear facilities. And of course, the recent developments were that Iran had agreed to what they call indirect talks, and that's supposedly what's happening this Saturday in Oman, though Trump himself has said these are direct talks. So in terms of the Iranian people, Iran is definitely not a monolith in the same way that the UK and United States are not. There's 90 million people with an array of views. I think the real consensus over the past few years, and you saw it come to head, was with the 2022 Women Life Freedom Uprising, is that many Iranians don't want this regime anymore. And that sentiment continues to exist because they see that they're dealing with systemic mismanagement, corruption, and repression. Once upon a time, they used to blame sanctions in the United States and the West for their economic woes, and that was during the lead up to the original JCPOA that was signed in 2015. But over the years, and again, in the past few especially, Iranians have turned their anger towards their government, and you see it with their chants, like when they say that the enemy's right here. They tell us it's the US, but they're right here. Or they say no to Gaza, no to Lebanon, our lives for Iran, which is basically them saying, why are you funding our proxies when we need the money spent here on the people?
And Holly, give us a sense of how much is that playing out in Iran right now? Are you getting protests? Are people saying that?
Day in and day out, Iranians are expressing their grievances against the regime. They're not making Western headlines, but for example, women are violating mandatory hijab rules on a daily basis. We saw anti-regime protests actually happen in February, the week marking the Islamic Republic coming to being in 1979. And it was in a very small provincial town in the Southwest, and a lot of people got arrested, and they also had an internet shutdown. The most recent one, of course, is now that they're having a water crisis in Iran, and a lot of farmers are actually protesting the situation. So when we talk about nuclear negotiations and why Tehran wants to come to the table, it's also because the country is in a dire situation, and it's because of the economy, it's because of their mismanagement of their own water, and this historic grievances that Iranians have against the Islamic Republic. And so they need a Band-Aid. They need to be able to keep afloat for the next 4 years under Trump, because arguably the regime's survival is at risk right now, and it's feeling very vulnerable, especially given the developments in the region in the past years since October 7th, 2023.
That's so interesting. So there's a lot of pressure on the Iranian government to take part in these talks because there are protests and there's a real sense of anger among the public at the state of the country. Give us a sense of these maximum pressure sanctions and their impact on the economy. I mean, what is life like for ordinary Iranians? How hard is life right now?
As I said earlier, there's a host of reasons that are leading to this economic impact. For instance, potatoes are a very common thing we buy in the US and UK, but imagine there was a 217% increase on potatoes, because that's what happened in Iran in recent weeks. We've seen that the Iranian rial has lost half of its worth in the span of 8 months. So Iranians are having to think twice about what they buy in the supermarket. And they're having struggles making their rents. And I'm hearing even from people I talk to that individuals or companies are going bankrupt that you wouldn't think that are going bankrupt. But then there's the other side of it, which is that there are regime elites that are benefiting from the economic situation, that they're actually getting richer through the black market economy because they're benefiting from this isolation and they're able to make money off of this isolation. And so Iranians are also exposed to that, and that's in part what's also driving some of the anger, because they're seeing people roll around in Maseratis, Mercedes, and I heard recently a Rolls Royce, a very new one. And so
despite sanctions.
Despite sanctions. And so ordinary Iranians are seeing that. That's in part why they're pointing the fingers at mismanagement and corruption.
They show no sign of ending, and the regime cannot hide the protests which are continuing to escalate across the country. Despite cutting internet access, these images made their way onto social media. They show oil workers at key refineries now joining in the demonstrations. The footage offers a window on a nation convulsing with anger.
And I think most famously, a story I broke years ago for Al Monitor was The Rich Kids of Tehran, which was an Instagram account highlighting the lives of elites at the height of multilateral sanctions, which were even more punitive than the ones we're seeing now, because it was the EU, US, and the UN imposing sanctions on Iran that led to the JCPOA.
Wow. That gives us a sense of what the Iranian government takes to these talks on Saturday, why they really matter to them, because there is so much anger in their own country. They need a win. Holly, at the same time, Donald Trump is coming to these negotiations when there's an awful lot of talk. And a lot of people listening to this would have been, we've all been concentrating on tariffs and everything else that's happening in the news at the moment. But behind all of that, there are lots of rumors, and they seem to be growing, about the potential for, as you said earlier, a military strike on Iran. You're in Washington, D.C. Benjamin Netanyahu was there earlier this week. Just tell us a bit about that visit. And we assume Iran would have been on the agenda.
I watched it, as everyone else, that the news had broke that while President Donald Trump was sitting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, that he announced that there were going to be direct negotiations in Oman on Saturday.
We're dealing with the Iranians. We have a very big meeting on Saturday, and we're dealing with them directly. A lot of people say, oh, maybe you're going through surrogates or you're not dealing directly, you're dealing through other countries. No, we're dealing with them directly, and maybe a deal is going to be made. That would be great.
It's hard to read Netanyahu's face in that moment, but it seemed like he may have been surprised by those remarks. It's really unclear if he had knowledge beforehand, and that may have been the driving factor for why he came to Washington. Of course, tariffs was another reason, in Gaza as well, but it was a sudden visit that was announced late last week. But I think what we really should be unpacking is what Trump wants himself. Trump has said that he wants a verifiable nuclear deal, so something that looks like the JCPOA, and this is something Middle East Special Envoy Steve Witkoff has been pushing for very publicly, and he will be leading these talks. And we know that Trump has a friendship with Witkoff, and he's been the lead on a lot of the negotiations. But we have people like National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, who is more familiar with the security side of Iran and arguably is an Iran hawk, that is actually saying that they need to do a full dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program, like we saw with Libya under the Muammar Gaddafi regime. And I think that divide is going to come to head on Saturday. From my understanding, there's going to be some changes probably to get more of the U.S. officials in line with what Trump wants.
To understand a bit more about those talks on Saturday, why they matter, and why the last deal, the JCPOA, which made the Iranians freeze their nuclear program in exchange for sanctions being lifted, ultimately failed, we called up an expert, Dr. Sanam Vakil.
I am the director of Chatham House's Middle East and North Africa program.
To find out what's at stake.
These are serious talks. Since 2019, Iran's nuclear program has accelerated dramatically. As more sanctions were placed on Iran, Iran began to violate more and more the nuclear agreement. So it has amassed high degrees of uranium enrichment. It is enriching centrifuges at higher levels and capabilities. And while intelligence agencies still say that Iran has not decided to weaponize its program, the international community, and particularly the United States, is concerned about the weaponization of Iran's nuclear program. So from the U.S. perspective and the broader international perspective, the goal is to put Iran's program back into a box. And what Iran is seeking to achieve is to perhaps roll back, although not completely dismantle its program, in exchange for meaningful long-term sanctions relief. So that is going to be the principal component of the discussion. What remains unclear as of right now is if the Iranians and the Americans are going to also talk about the other issues between them.
And just give us a sense of what they are, the other issues.
Number one is that Iran has been a longtime backer of what is known as the Axis of Resistance, the groups and networks across a number of Arab countries, such as Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, groups in Iraq. A second issue, and equally important, is Iran supporting Russia in the war in Ukraine, providing drones and ballistic missiles to Moscow.
And Sanam, these talks would have had to happen soon, regardless of whether Donald Trump was in the White House or not, just because the terms of the original deal, the JCPOA, were due to expire. Just take us back to where all of this begins. Take us to 2015, when that deal, the Iran nuclear deal, was actually done. What was the agreement and how did it come about?
So the JCPOA is an important multilateral agreement that was negotiated over a 10-year period between Iran, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, the United States, Russia, and China. And this configuration of countries came together very concerned that Iran's nuclear program was advancing and needed to be checked. So the objective was to have a commitment from Iran never to pursue a nuclear weapon and to allow for regular oversight and inspection of Iran's civilian nuclear program that is entitled to have under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, of which Iran is a signatory. But this agreement that was negotiated also had what are called sunset clauses, basically endpoints to them. And 2025, October 18th of 2025 to be precise, is one of the last final endpoints of the agreement. This matters because ultimately it's an opportunity for the US and Iran to be sitting down and thinking about how to build maybe a better agreement. But with that has to also come the incentives to encourage Iran to return to compliance and perhaps comply for longer.
In his first administration, Donald Trump pulled America out of the JCPOA. How much did that change the deal? Because as you mentioned, Iran has been bolstering its nuclear program regardless. Did it make it toothless?
Not immediately, but over time, certainly. So in the first year, Iran maintained compliance with its nuclear commitments in the hope that Europe would try and protect the deal to allow Western companies to continue engaging with the Iranian economy. But Europe wasn't able to create this structure that would shelter European companies from US sanctions. And so from there, the deal slowly began to collapse. Iran responded by slowly creeping up its enrichment capabilities, amassing more stockpiles.
Now, with the deal expiring, if no new deal emerges from these talks, will it mean it gives license to Iran to really accelerate its nuclear program, to weaponize it?
Technically, Iran, as a signatory of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, is bound to its commitments and should not weaponize its program. But what Iran could do, and this is relevant in the context of regional tensions since October 7th and the wars we've been seeing around the Middle East, is that Iran could make a calculated decision to weaponize its program in order to protect Iran from its perceived threats, be them from Washington or from Israel. But doing so would also be quite dangerous because it could invite military attack from Israel or obviously also from the United States. With the setbacks on Iran itself, this has led to a public debate taking place across the Iranian political establishment about the importance or value of Iran's nuclear program. And this is why this is, again, such a dangerous moment, because political elites in Iran are wondering out loud whether the Islamic Republic should weaponize.
Holly, you're in Washington. We're already seeing splits in the Trump camp over major issues like tariffs. It does seem as if Iran is going to be another very serious dividing line. You said that we should be looking at what President Trump wants himself. People often say that to understand his motivations, one of the driving factors seems to be that he's desperate to get a Nobel Peace Prize. He wants to be seen as the man who gets the deal. He wants to prove that he can get a better deal than Obama did.
Correct. I've said that since Trump 1.0, that if Trump had his druthers, he would have a deal with golden letters on the same JCPOA it was and be content with it because he wants to claim it for his own. And I think we have seen an iteration of this come out with the North Korea talks in his first administration. And I wouldn't be surprised if we ended up with a 2-page paper a la North Korea that wouldn't be very profound. The negotiations that led to the JCPOA took a lot of time because the best and the brightest on nuclear issues and sanctions relief sat there and argued about these things for days, for months, and even years if you want to go back to the original talks. This isn't some business deal, but this is the problem is that, and I think this is what's ruffling a lot of feathers, is that it's being treated as such. But I don't understand, as an Iran analyst and someone that's been watching Trump for years now, how is this surprising given that that's how he's been dealing with many things over the years?
And there are people in Trump's camp who support this for different reasons, not just because they want to be seen to get the deal, but people like J.D. Vance, his vice president, who really believe in the America First agenda. For them, war in Iran presumably would be a disaster.
Correct. I think there's 3 camps in the admin, and J.D. Vance is part of the isolationist camp, which is that they don't want any wars anymore. There's, of course, the billionaires, it's like Steve Witkoff, who I just talked about, and Elon Musk, who are in the business of making deals. And the third camp, which I mentioned, was National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, which is the Iran hawks. So they're the security folks that know the Iran file well. And so I think there's really going to be a divide on how to move ahead. And I think you're going to see that the isolationists and the deal makers are going to be in a marriage of convenience just because they actually share the view of how do we solve this issue and make it through the America First agenda. And I think that in the coming days and lead up to these talks on Saturday, which I was told were a surprise to many, that there's going to be a lot of infighting about how to deal with Tehran.
Holly, take us to the hawks next. We know that there has always been a movement within the Republican Party that's been very anti-Iran, that's wanted a showdown for a long time. Why does now seem like a particularly good moment to try and take Iran on militarily?
Well, I would say in their thinking is that the developments in the post-October 7th world, we had 2 tit-for-tat strikes between Iran and Israel last year. And Israel left Iran in a very vulnerable position the second time around with its air defenses. And of course, with Iran's proxies maimed in the region, whether it be Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen have been, of course, another example. But more importantly, one of its top allies, the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria, has toppled. And so this cover, as part of Iran's forward defense strategy, has been severely weakened. And so the hawks in Washington and even in Israel argue that this is the time to take out Iran's nuclear facilities in its entirety because they won't have a better opportunity in the future.
And you hear them describing it as taking out the head of the serpent, effectively. Give us a sense of how much Israel is playing into this. I mean, what will Netanyahu have been pitching to Donald Trump when he was there? What would a potential strike actually look like? How would it play out?
Israel recognizes that if it was to do it alone, it wouldn't be able to take out its facilities in its entirety. And I imagine that they were pitching that we need the United States' help to make this happen. And so what that entails is that Israel doesn't have the right bunker buster bombs to actually take out the facilities which are deep underground. And so I imagine if this was a 2-part thing, they could do it together, but Israel doing it on its own, it would in essence be another version of mowing the lawn. They would slow down the program, but not be able to end it in its entirety like they did with Operation Opera in Iraq in the 1980s or what they've done in Syria.
And how much do you think Trump is influenced by Netanyahu? I mean, could he be talked into this?
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has influenced his thinking to an extent before. We saw that in the lead up to Trump's withdrawal from the JCPOA in 2018. Netanyahu came out with a presentation in English, not in Hebrew, because he had a specific audience of one, and had said that they had found some new information on Iran's nuclear program, which turned out to be not exactly accurate. And that was arguably part of what pushed the Trump administration to make that final stretch to pull out of the JCPOA in May of 2018. Netanyahu also, once the U.S. presidential election of 2020 happened, we saw that Netanyahu had actually congratulated President-elect Joe Biden. And from our understanding, that wasn't something that Trump really enjoyed, given that he had said it was a fraudulent election. So I think there's some complex dynamics at play, but I think if Trump wants to do something, he'll do it, but it also depends on who's the last person in the room with him, too. I think that can influence his thinking.
So, Holly, as we head towards these crunch talks on Saturday, there's obviously an awful lot at stake, a lot that will be fought over. For you, what do you think is the best case scenario? I mean, can Iran make use of the idea that Donald Trump doesn't necessarily want a war, he wants a deal? Could this be the moment you get a really great deal?
Unfortunately, I don't think so, because arms control negotiations take a lot of thinking, as I noted earlier. You need the best and the brightest on both sides to come together and come up with the language, the details, and an understanding of the nuclear program to get there. And from what we're seeing so far and what we've seen on Ukraine and Gaza, there's not a lot of deep thinking about how to move the ball. And so I imagine with Iran, it wouldn't be the same. Arguably, these talks could be in Tehran's benefit, because even if they agreed to something very basic and simple, they could potentially have Trump make this pass as a treaty in Congress, because he would be the only U.S. president that would get that support, because the Republicans would actually get in line with him. Otherwise, they would be seen as against the MAGA movement or America First agenda. So this could be to Tehran's benefit. But just on the people side of it, if there was to be sanctions relief, this would merely be a Band-Aid on the systemic mismanagement and corruption in the country. And it would help the regime for the time being. But as long as those systemic issues that have brought discontent on the ground are not addressed, inevitably we will be seeing protests in Iran and calling for the continued ouster of the Islamic Republic.
Yeah, that would carry on. There would still be a huge pressure on the government. In the worst case scenario, if nothing is agreed and if Donald Trump thinks that is the moment, therefore, to launch a military strike, just describe how that would go down in Iran. I mean, there's lots of pressure on the government now, but how would ordinary people respond to the idea of America or Israel backed by America attacking?
Well, I don't know anybody that wants war, and it's no different with Iranians. But I think there is some complex dynamics at play. There are some Iranians that are vehemently anti-regime and realize that maybe this would be the only way for the ouster of the regime. But in the wide scale of things, it is scary for Iranians. When the tit-for-tat strikes happened between Iran and Israel, late at night, of course, some had lined up at gas stations to fill up their gas tanks. Others were going to any Quickie Mart that was open to buy whatever supplies they could, because they had memories of the bloody Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. But then there were others that had actually started a hashtag, activists and the families of protesters that have been killed over the years, that were saying that war is very scary, but, and the caveat with the but is that the Islamic Republic was way worse than war, because they had been at war with their people for 4 decades. And so imagine what position people have to be in to feel that way, that they would think that war would be a better option than the repression they're living under. So it's a very complex conversation in Iran. And like I said, there's so many diverse views, you really can't point it to one versus the other.
That was Holly Dagres, Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute, and before that, Dr. Sanam Vakil from Chatham House. The producers today were Edith Rousselot and Edward Drummond. The executive producer was Molly Guinness, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Assetto. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.